The shop is dead quiet after midnight, just the tick of cooling engines and the hum of the overhead lights. That's why I heard it right away. The low growl of a diesel engine rolling into the lot. I wiped my hands on a rag and looked up. Bay 3's door was half open, and a truck I didn't recognize was idling there. Big rig, old paint, chrome dull with road grime. The windows were too dark to see inside, but the air smelled like wet asphalt and burnt rubber. I called out. No answer. The brakes hissed once, slow and sharp, and the engine choked into silence. When I stepped closer, the bay was empty. No truck, no lights, nothing. Then I looked down. There were wet boot prints on the concrete, fresh, leading straight from the bay into the office. My name's Jake Olson, and I've been working nights at Gravel Lane Garage for 3 months now. Came here from Sioux City after my old man's construction business went under. Needed work, needed distance from the collection calls and repo men circling our house like vultures. Winterset's a small town, population barely cracking 5,000, but it's got enough truck traffic from I-35 to keep a garage busy. Old Pete Kowalski hired me sight unseen when I called about the night shift opening. Said he was desperate. Most folks don't want to work midnight to 8, especially not alone in a shop that sits on the edge of town where the streetlights give up and the corn starts. But I needed the money, and I've always been good with my hands. The garage squats on Gravel Lane like a concrete toad, all bay doors and oil stains. 3 service bays, a small office with a coffee maker that gurgles like it's dying, and a parts room that smells like brake fluid and cigarettes. Pete left me a ring of keys, a thermos of coffee that tastes like motor oil, and a handwritten list tucked under the register. Rules for the night shift, he'd scrawled across the top in shaky ballpoint. Follow them, no exceptions. I'd laughed when I first read it. Figured Pete was just being paranoid about liability or something. Small-town business owners get weird about insurance claims. But after tonight, after the truck that wasn't there and the boot prints that led nowhere, I'm thinking maybe Pete wasn't being paranoid enough. The coffee's gone cold in my cup, and the office feels smaller than it did an hour ago. Outside, the wind pushes through the oak trees that line the property, making them creak like old bones. Highway 92 stretches empty in both directions, twin ribbons of asphalt that disappear into farmland and darkness. I pulled Pete's list from the drawer and spread it flat under the desk lamp. 8 rules, written in that same shaky hand. Simple enough, common sense mostly. Or so I thought. The boot prints are still there, getting fainter as they dry. But they're there. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice that sounds suspiciously like my father's is telling me to fold up that list, grab my coat, and drive back to Sioux City before morning. But I need this job. And besides, they're just rules. How hard could they be to follow? I smoothed out Pete's crumpled note and read through his rules one more time. 8 items in faded blue ink. Some words darker where he'd pressed hard with the pen. Night shift protocols. Gravel Lane Garage. Lock the front office door at 12:30 a.m. sharp. Check it twice. Never answer the phone between 2:17 a.m. and 2:23 a.m. Let it ring. If you hear knocking after 1 a.m., count the knocks. Only open for groups of 4. Bay 3 stays closed unless a customer specifically asks for it. Then charge double. Keep the radio on WOI 640 AM. If it goes to static, change the station immediately. Coffee pot stays on all night, fresh pot every 2 hours. Don't let it run dry. If someone asks about the Kowalski special, tell them we're out of parts. Leave by 8:15:01. Not earlier, not later. The first few seemed reasonable enough. Pete was probably just particular about security and procedures. But the phone rule made my skin crawl. Why those specific minutes? And what the hell was the Kowalski special? I checked my watch. 12:28 a.m. Time to lock up. The front door's deadbolt turned with a solid click. I tested the handle twice, just like the rule said. Through the glass, gravel lanes stretched away into cornfields, streetlights forming pools of yellow every 100 yards until they petered out entirely. A red barn sat silhouetted against the sky about a quarter-mile down, owned by the Henriksen family, according to Pete. They raised hogs and minded their own business. Back in the office, I flipped the radio to WOI. Farm reports and commodity prices drifted from the speaker, punctuated by static bursts when trucks passed on the highway. I started a fresh pot of coffee, though the one from earlier was still half full. 12:45 a.m. came and went. Nothing happened. Around 1:15, I heard the first knock. 3 sharp raps on the front door. I froze, wrench halfway to a bolt on the Chevrolet pickup I'd been working on. The rule said only answer for groups of 4, but my customer service instincts kicked in. Someone might need help. Flat tire, dead battery, any number of problems that happened to folks traveling this late. I walked to the front windows and peered out. A figure stood by the door, barely visible in the weak porch light. Tall, wearing what looked like coveralls. Work boots, the kind truckers favor. He knocked again, 3 more times, same rhythm. Not 4. I stayed put. The figure stepped back and tilted his head up toward the windows. Even in the dim light, I could see his face was wrong somehow. Not deformed or injured, just arranged differently than faces should be, like someone had taken a photograph and shifted the pieces around before developing it. He raised his hand and knocked once more. 3 knocks. Then he turned and walked away, his boots making wet slapping sounds on the asphalt, even though it hadn't rained in days. I watched until he disappeared beyond the streetlights, then double-checked the door lock. The radio crackled. Severe weather watch remains in effect for Madison County. Then static, harsh, and sudden. My hand shot to the dial, spinning through stations until I found clear reception on KASI, out of Ames. Change stations immediately, the rule said. I didn't want to find out why. 2:10 a.m. 7 minutes until the phone window Pete had warned about. I topped off my coffee and tried to focus on the Chevy's transmission, but my ears stayed tuned to the phone on the office desk. A black rotary model that looked like it belonged in a 1960s diner. Pete probably bought it used from Maytag when they closed their Winterset plant back in '82. 2:16 a.m. I held my breath. 2:17. The phone rang. Shrill, piercing, the kind of ring that cuts through your skull and sets your teeth on edge. I counted. 5 rings. 10. 15. Each one felt like fingernails on a chalkboard. Whoever was calling wasn't giving up. 2:20 a.m. Still ringing. My hand twitched toward the receiver. What if it was Pete? What if there was an emergency? What if someone really needed help? 2:22 a.m. The ringing stopped. 2:23. Silence settled over the garage like dust. I realized I'd been holding my breath and let it out slowly. Whatever Pete knew about those 6 minutes, he was right to warn me. The rest of the shift passed without incident. I changed the coffee at 4 a.m. and again at 6. The radio stayed clear. Nobody else knocked. When 8:15 rolled around, I was already pulling on my jacket, Pete's rules folded safely in my pocket. But as I drove home to my apartment above Doherty's feed store, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in Winterset had been watching me all night. Something that knocked in groups of 3 and called during the witching hour. Something that knew I was there Hi everyone. Before we move forward, I have something exciting to tell you. Many of you asked for stories without the strange rules, so I created a brand new channel just for that. It's called Mr. Grimm Archive. The link is in the description, or you can click the card above. I think you'll really enjoy it. So check it out whenever you want some more exciting types of stories. Also, I hope you're enjoying the 2 uploads a day. Let me know in the comments if you like some stories from your location. Now, let's continue with today's story. 3 nights later, I was starting to think maybe Pete's rules weren't so crazy after all. The knocker hadn't returned, but I'd heard him at other places around town. Mrs. Lindquist at the grocery store mentioned someone rapping on her bedroom window Tuesday night. 3 knocks, then silence. Deputy Nash said they'd gotten reports from 4 different houses, all the same pattern, all between midnight and 3 a.m. Probably just kids, Nash had said when I stopped by Casey's for gas. Halloween's coming up. Teenagers get restless. But I'd seen that face. Kids didn't arrange their features like puzzle pieces left in the rain. Tonight felt different from the moment I clocked in. The air hung thick and still, like the moments before a thunderstorm. The coffee maker gurgled louder than usual, and the radio kept drifting, despite my efforts to hold the frequency. Static crept in at the edges, whispers in languages I didn't recognize. At 1:47 a.m., a pickup truck pulled into the lot. This one was real. I could see the driver through the windshield, a woman in a John Deere cap with graying hair. The truck was a mid-90s Ford, painted the kind of green farmers favored, with enough rust around the wheel wells to prove it earned its keep. It rolled to a stop in front of Bay 1. I wiped my hands and walked out to meet her. She climbed down from the cab slowly, favoring her left knee. Probably arthritis. A lot of farm folks dealt with joint pain from years of hard labor. "Evening," I said. "What can I help you with?" She looked me up and down, taking in my coveralls and the grease under my fingernails. "You're the new nightman Pete hired." "That's right. Jake Olson. Dorothy Henriksen." She gestured toward the red barn I could see from the office windows. "Live just down the lane. Got a problem with my transmission." I nodded toward the truck. "What's she doing?" "Slipping something fierce. Started yesterday when I was hauling feed from the co-op in Des Moines. Gets worse when she's under load." Dorothy pulled off her cap and ran fingers through thin hair. "Pete always took good care of this old girl. Hoping you can do the same. Standard transmission work." I quoted her a fair price and asked which bay she preferred. "Bay 3, she said without hesitation. "Always used Bay 3. The words hit my chest like a sledgehammer. Rule 4. Bay 3 stays closed unless a customer specifically asks for it. Then charge double. I doubled the estimate. Dorothy nodded like she'd expected it. "Pete warn you about the bay?" she asked as I raised the door. "He mentioned it was different. Different's one word for it." She backed the truck into position with practiced ease. "Been coming here 15 years. Always Bay 3. Pete never explained why. Just said some bays work better for certain problems." I connected the diagnostic computer and ran through the standard checks. Everything looked normal on the surface. Fluid levels good, no obvious leaks, electrical systems functioning. But when I test drove the truck around the lot, I felt what Dorothy meant. The transmission didn't just slip. It hesitated, like something was fighting the gears from inside. Back in Bay 3, I raised the truck on the lift and crawled underneath. The transmission pan was warm to the touch, warmer than it should be after just a short drive. When I drained the fluid, it came out darker than old blood, with an odor that reminded me of the rendering plant outside Indianola. That's when I found them. Scratches in the metal. Not random wear patterns or damage from road debris. These were deliberate marks, carved into the transmission housing in symbols I didn't recognize. They formed a rough circle around the pan, with lines radiating outward like spokes on a wheel. Or tentacles. "Dorothy," I called. "How long have you had this truck?" "Bought her new in '94. Why?" "These markings under here, they look old. Really old." She appeared at the edge of the bay, peering under the lift. "Oh, those. Pete put them there." "Pete carved symbols into your transmission?" "Not carved. Painted. Some kind of special coating he used on certain vehicles." Dorothy's voice carried the matter-of-fact tone farmers used when discussing things city folks wouldn't understand. Said it helped with the alignment. I stared at the marks. They weren't painted. They were definitely carved, etched deep into the metal like someone had used acid or a cutting torch. But arguing with customers never helped anyone. "Alignment of what?" "You'd have to ask Pete." She checked her watch. "How long you think this'll take?" I quoted her 3 hours. Standard transmission service in Bay 3 apparently required more than mechanical expertise. While the new fluid circulated, I called Pete's house. No answer. His cell went straight to voicemail, a gravelly recording that just said, "Leave a message," before the beep. I tried focusing on the work, but those symbols kept drawing my attention. Under the harsh shop lights, they seemed to shift and writhe like living things. Twice I thought I saw them glow faintly, but when I looked directly, they were just scratches in metal. The radio started acting up around 3 a.m. Static invaded WOI's signal, growing stronger despite my attempts to clear the frequency. Voices emerged from the white noise, not English, not any language I recognized. They rose and fell in rhythms that matched my heartbeat. Rule 5. If it goes to static, change the station immediately. I spun the dial to KASI, then WHO when that station faded. The voices followed, bleeding through every frequency like water through cracked glass. Finally, I found a Christian station out of Ottumwa playing hymns. The voices retreated, but I could still hear them underneath the music, patient and waiting. Dorothy's truck was ready by 4:30. The transmission ran smooth as silk, shifting through gears like butter. Whatever Pete's special coating did, it worked. "How much I owe you?" Dorothy asked, pulling out a worn checkbook. I told her the doubled rate. She wrote the check without complaint, then paused before tearing it off. "Jake, you seem like a decent young man. Let me give you some advice." She looked toward Bay 3, where the overhead light flickered despite being brand new. "Some things in this world don't follow the rules we learned in school. Pete understands that. He's been keeping this town safe for a long time." "Safe from what?" "From the things that live in the spaces between." She handed me the check. "Follow his rules, all of them, and if something ever asks you about the Kowalski special." She paused, studying my face. "Well, just remember that some parts can't be ordered from NAPA." Dorothy drove away, her transmission purring like a contented cat. I watched her taillights disappear toward the Henriksen farm, then looked back at Bay 3. The symbols were gone. Smooth metal gleamed under the shop lights. No trace of the markings I'd spent half the night staring at. But the smell lingered. Rendering plant and old blood, mixed with something else I couldn't identify. Something that smelled like fear. A week passed before I understood what Dorothy meant about the spaces between. Thursday night started normal enough. Typical autumn weather for central Iowa. Crisp air that bit at exposed skin. the kind that made you grateful for heated shops and hot coffee. I've gotten comfortable with Pete's routine. Lock the door at 12:30, keep the radio tuned, brew fresh coffee every 2 hours without fail. That last rule seemed pointless until the coffee maker broke. It happened around 1:15 a.m. while I was replacing brake pads on a Buick that belonged to Father Martinez from St. Joseph's. The coffee maker gave a sharp pop, like a light bulb burning out, followed by the acrid smell of fried electronics. When I checked the machine, the heating element had cracked clean through. No warning, no gradual failure, just sudden death. I found Pete's emergency contact list taped inside the cash register drawer. His home number, his cell, and a third number labeled Emergencies Only, Landline. All three went to voicemail. Without fresh coffee, I was violating Rule 6. Don't let it run dry, Pete had written. But the machine was dead, and I couldn't exactly drive to Casey's for supplies. The gas station closed at midnight anyway. I tried not to panic. Rules were guidelines, right? Common sense safety measures. But Dorothy's words kept echoing. Follow his rules. All of them. By 2 a.m., the pot held maybe 2 inches of coffee, thick as motor oil, and twice as bitter. I rationed it, taking small sips every few minutes. The radio played farm reports and commodity prices, voices of night DJs who sounded increasingly distant. 2:17 came and went. The phone stayed silent. At 2:45, I heard scratching inside the walls, soft at first, like mice scurrying through insulation. But mice don't scratch in patterns. These sounds had rhythm, purpose. They started behind the parts storage room and worked their way around the shop's perimeter, staying just inside the drywall. I grabbed a flashlight and traced the sounds. They moved faster than I could follow, always one step ahead. When I pressed my ear to the wall, the scratching stopped. When I stepped away, it resumed with renewed vigor. The coffee was nearly gone. 1/4 inch of sludge in the bottom of the pot, barely enough to wet my lips. I checked my watch. 3:30 a.m. 4.5 hours until my shift ended. 4.5 hours without the protection Pete's rules provided. That's when I noticed the temperature dropping. Not outside, inside the shop. My breath began misting with each exhale. The concrete floor felt like ice through my work boots. I cranked up the space heater in the office, but it barely made a dent in the cold. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. Whatever lived in the walls was getting restless. At 4 a.m., I should have brewed fresh coffee. Instead, I stared at the broken machine and tried not to think about what might happen next. The pot was empty now, not even residue left. I'd failed Rule 6 completely. The front door handle rattled, not knocking this time. Someone was testing the lock, twisting the handle back and forth with mechanical persistence. I crept to the windows and peered out, but the porch light had burned out sometime during the night. Darkness pressed against the glass like black water. The handle stopped moving. Footsteps circled the building. Slow, measured steps that didn't quite match human gait. Too long between each footfall, like something was considering where to place its weight. I grabbed the phone and dialed Pete's emergency number. It rang once, then connected to dead air. No dial tone, no static. Just empty space that seemed to breathe. "Pete," I whispered into the void. Something whispered back. Not words, just the suggestion of communication, like voices heard through deep water. I hung up and retreated to the office. The radio had drifted to static again, but when I reached for the dial, a hand slammed against the front door. Then another, and another. They weren't knocking now. They were pounding, each impact shaking the reinforced glass in its frame. I counted the strikes. 3, 4, 5. Way more than the groups of 4 that Rule 3 allowed. The coffee pot sat empty on its burner, mocking me. I checked every cabinet, every drawer, looking for backup supplies. Nothing. Pete kept instant coffee in his desk, but that was locked, and I didn't have keys to the office furniture. The pounding stopped. Silence settled over the garage like snow. Even the scratching in the walls had ceased. I held my breath and listened, straining for any sound that might tell me what was happening outside. A new noise reached my ears, metal groaning under stress, not the building settling or wind against the roof. This was deliberate pressure being applied somewhere specific. The loading dock. I grabbed a wrench and crept toward the rear of the shop. Bay 3's overhead door was bending inward, warping as if something massive was pressing against it from outside. The reinforced steel groaned and buckled, but held. For now. I thought about calling 911, but what would I tell them? That something was trying to break into the garage because my coffee maker died. Deputy Nash already thought I was jumpy. This would convince him I'd lost my mind entirely. More pressure. The door's center panel began to bow inward, metal fatigue creating stress fractures along the welds. Whatever was out there possessed strength no human could match. Then I remembered Dorothy's transmission, the symbols that appeared and disappeared. Pete's special coating that made machinery run smooth as silk. Bay 3. I ran to the diagnostic computer and pulled up Dorothy's work order from the previous week. Pete kept detailed records, including photos of every job. I scrolled through images of transmission housings, brake assemblies, engine blocks. There, Dorothy's transmission pan, before and after shots. In the before photo, the metal showed normal wear and corrosion, but the after shot revealed those same symbols I'd seen under the lift. Not scratches carved by tools, but markings that seemed to grow from the metal itself. And in the corner of each photo, barely visible, was a coffee mug. Steam rising from the rim. Coffee. Pete drank coffee while working in Bay 3. The rule wasn't about staying alert or following routine. The coffee was part of the process. Part of whatever ritual kept those symbols functional and the things outside at bay. The loading dock door gave another groan. I could see actual light between the panels now. Not street light, but something colder. Something that hurt to look at directly. I needed coffee. Real coffee, not instant powder or gas station swill. I needed the same blend Pete used, brewed the same way, consumed while working on vehicles that carried invisible protection. But the machine was broken, and Pete was unreachable. And something that lived in the spaces between was testing the structural integrity of every barrier between us. I checked my watch. 4:47 a.m., 3.5 hours until 8:15. 3.5 hours until I could leave, if the doors held that long. If the coffee's absence didn't invite worse things than whatever was already circling the building. If I could figure out what the hell Pete Kowalski really did in this garage when the sun went down. The scratching in the walls resumed, louder now, purposeful, like something was chewing through insulation and wiring, working its way toward the electrical panel, toward the lights that kept the real darkness away. I clutched the wrench tighter and wondered if Pete's rules were warnings or incantations. Either way, I'd broken one of them, and something out there knew it. The electrical panel was in the parts room, mounted on the wall behind shelves of oil filters and spark plugs. I could hear them working now, not scratching anymore, but chewing. Systematic destruction of copper wiring, working their way toward the main breakers. I grabbed every flashlight I could find and lined them up on the workbench. 3 small pen light types, 1 heavy-duty mag light that felt reassuring in my hands, and a rechargeable LED unit Pete kept for power outages. Not much, but better than darkness. The lights flickered once, held, flickered again. Whatever was in the walls had found something important. I tried Pete's numbers again, even though I knew they wouldn't answer. This time his home phone didn't even ring, just a busy signal that pulsed like a heartbeat. His cell was completely dead. No signal at all. 5:23 a.m. Less than 3 hours to go. The loading dock door gave a sharp crack. Through the gap, I could see movement outside, shapes that flowed like liquid shadow, darker than the pre-dawn sky. They pressed against every entrance, testing weak points, searching for ways inside. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. Pete's filing cabinet was locked, but desperate times called for creative solutions. A pry bar from the tool rack made short work of the cheap lock mechanism. Inside, I found 20 years of meticulous records, customer files, parts orders, maintenance schedules. But underneath the mundane business documents lay something else entirely, a letter-bound journal filled with Pete's handwriting. The first entry was dated October 15th, 1987. Took over the garage today. Previous owner, Eddie Kowalski, left more than just the business. He left obligations. The things that live beneath Madison County aren't gone. They're sleeping. The garage sits on one of their doorways. The rules keep them down there. I flipped through pages of careful observations, vehicle modifications, symbols that matched what I'd seen on Dorothy's transmission, lists of families who'd been protected over the years. Henriksons, Rasmussens, O'Briens, dozens of others. The coffee contains iron filings, read one entry. Ground so fine they dissolve completely. Iron burns them, keeps them anchored to their realm. Without it, the barriers weaken. My empty coffee pot suddenly made terrifying sense. Bay 3 amplifies the protection. The symbols carved into the foundation channel energy upward. Vehicles serviced there carry shields, temporary, but enough to keep families safe on the back roads where the things hunt. I found a section labeled Emergency Protocols and read with growing dread. If the coffee runs out before sunrise, retreat to Bay 3. The symbols are strongest there. Close the overhead door and don't open it until full daylight. The things can't manifest in direct sunlight. Too much iron in the soil here. Old mining country. The lights flickered again, longer this time. When they came back up, they were dimmer than before. I stuffed the journal into my jacket and headed for Bay 3. The overhead door's motor whined as I activated it, metal cables straining under the weight. As the door sealed shut, the temperature inside began to rise. The concrete floor felt warmer underfoot. That's when I noticed the symbols. They covered everything. The floor, the walls, even the ceiling, carved deep into concrete and steel, filled with what looked like lead or pewter. Under the bay's fluorescent lights, they formed a complex pattern that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. Protection rooms, that's what Eddie Kowalski had left behind. That's what Pete had maintained for 35 years. I checked Pete's journal for more details about the emergency protocol. According to his notes, Bay 3 was a sanctuary, as long as the door stayed closed and the symbols remained intact. But as I read, the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in immediately, casting everything in hellish red. The battery backup would last maybe an hour. After that, complete darkness. In the crimson glow, the symbols looked different. They seemed to move, writhing like a living tissue. The pattern they formed was clearer now, concentric circles with radiating lines. Not just protection, but containment. A lock. Something was trying to unlock it. The scratching resumed, but louder now, much louder. They were inside the bay somehow, working on the symbols themselves. I could hear metal tools scraping against concrete, methodical chipping that sent vibrations through the floor. I grabbed the mag light and swept the beam across the walls. The scratching stopped instantly, but I could see fresh gouges in several of the symbols. Deep cuts that severed the pattern's continuity. "Don't let them break the circle," Pete had written. "Once the pattern is severed, the lock opens. 35 years of accumulation will pour through at once." I needed to repair the damage, but with what? The journal mentioned lead solder kept in a locked cabinet near the compressed air tank. More creative lockpicking revealed tubes of metal-filled putty and a small acetylene torch. The emergency lights flickered. Maybe 40 minutes left. I lit the torch and began filling the damaged symbols, working as quickly as I dared. The lead sizzled as it touched the carved stone, releasing acrid smoke that burned my lungs. But the symbols glowed brighter as I repaired them, pushing back against the darkness that pressed at the edges of my vision. Something pounded on the overhead door from outside, not the systematic testing from before. This was rage. Fury at being denied what it considered rightfully theirs. More scratching, this time from multiple directions. They were all around me now, working on different parts of the pattern. I couldn't repair fast enough to keep up with the damage. The torch sputtered, fuel running low. I checked my watch, 6:47 a.m., 90 minutes until sunrise, 88 minutes until I could leave. The emergency lights died. Complete darkness wrapped around me like a burial shroud. I fumbled for the mag light, nearly dropping it in my panic. When the beam cut through the black, I saw them. Shadows with substance, shapes that hurt to perceive directly, as if my brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing. They clung to the walls like mold, their attention focused on the damaged symbols. They were chewing through Pete's protections with teeth that looked like broken glass. I played the light across them and they recoiled, but didn't retreat. Instead, they adapted, moving faster, working in my blind spots, coordinating their attack on the symbol pattern with something approaching intelligence. The torch died completely. Only the flashlight stood between me and whatever these things would become once they broke the lock completely. I thought about running for the door, making a break for my truck, and driving away from Winterset as fast as the roads would allow. But Pete's journal had made one thing clear. These things didn't stay in the garage. They spread, they hunted, and without the protections he'd maintained for 3 decades, they'd pour through Madison County like floodwater through a broken dam. Dorothy Henriksen lived just down the lane. Father Martinez at St. Joseph's. Deputy Mash and his family. Hundreds of people who had no idea that their safety depended on an old mechanic's secret war against things that lived in spaces between reality. I couldn't let them break through, not on my watch. The maglight's beam was weakening. The battery wouldn't last much longer. But I had one advantage these shadow things didn't expect. I knew where Pete kept his emergency supplies, and some repairs required more than solder and careful craftsmanship. Sometimes you had to fight fire with fire, or in this case, fight shadows with something much brighter than a dying flashlight. Pete's emergency cabinet sat behind the air compressor, painted safety yellow and marked with a radiation symbol that made my stomach clench. The lock was heavy-duty, military-grade, but the pry bar had served me well so far tonight. Inside, I found things that no mechanic should need. Road flares, dozens of them, the kind highway crews used for accident scenes, but these were different, heavier, with cores that glowed faintly in the darkness. The labels were handwritten in Pete's careful script. Iron phosphorus composite. Burn time, 30 minutes. Effective range, 20 feet. Below the flares lay something that made my hands shake. A modified propane torch, but the fuel tank was marked with symbols that matched the floor pattern. The nozzle had been replaced with what looked like a laboratory burner, designed to produce a precise, controlled flame. And at the bottom of the cabinet, wrapped in oiled leather, was a shotgun. Not just any shotgun. This was a Remington 870 with custom modifications, shortened barrel, extended magazine, and shells that rattled when I picked them up. The brass casings were etched with the same protection symbols, and whatever was inside them was heavier than standard buckshot. Iron shot. Had to be. Pete's journal had one more entry I'd missed, written on the inside back cover. If they break through, don't try to be a hero. Light them up and hold the line until sunrise. The town depends on it. The shells are loaded with blessed iron filings and rock salt. Won't kill them, but it'll hurt enough to make them think twice. Remember, they can't cross running water or direct sunlight. Dawn comes at 7:23 a.m. this time of year. 7:23 a.m. 96 minutes away, the shadows were making progress on the symbol pattern. Large sections had been chewed away, and I could see cracks spreading through the concrete between the remaining rooms. The floor vibrated with each impact, like something massive was pounding against the underside of the foundation. I grabbed 3 flares and struck the first one. Light exploded through Bay 3, harsh red radiance that sent the shadow things recoiling toward the corners. But they didn't disappear, just condensed, waiting for their chance to resume their work. The flare burned with chemical intensity, throwing wild shadows across the walls. In that shifting light, I could see the full extent of the damage. Maybe half the protection circle remained intact. When the rest failed, whatever was down there would claw its way to the surface. I needed to slow them down, give myself time to think. The shotgun felt familiar in my hands. Dad had taught me to shoot when I was 12, hunting pheasants in the fields around Sioux City. This was different, though. These weren't birds that would drop with a clean shot. I aimed at the largest concentration of shadows and pulled the trigger. The blast echoed through the bay like thunder. Where the shot hit, shadow flesh burst apart in sprays of oily smoke. The things made sounds, not screams exactly, but vibrations that I felt in my bones rather than heard with my ears. They regrouped quickly, flowing back together like mercury. But for a few seconds, their attack on the symbols had stopped. I pumped another shell into the chamber and fired again. Same result. Temporary disruption, but no permanent damage. The first flare was burning low. I lit a second one and stuck it in a vise to keep my hands free. The red light flickered as something passed between the flare and the wall, too fast to track. My phone vibrated. Impossible. No signal had worked all night, but the screen showed an incoming call from Pete's number. Not his home or cell, but the emergency landline. I answered with one hand while keeping the shotgun ready. "Jake?" Pete's voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "You still in the garage?" "Pete, where the hell are you? The coffee machine broke and there are things." "I know. Dorothy called me. Said you'd figured out Bay 3. Static crackled across the connection. "Listen carefully. You can't hold them off with the shotgun alone. Too many of them, and they're hungry after 35 years of being locked away." "Then what do I do?" "The symbols aren't just protection. They're a binding circle. Eddie Kowalski used them to trap something down there in 1952. Mining accident opened a passage to somewhere else. 11 men died before Eddie figured out how to seal it." The shadows were adapting to the flare light, moving faster between the bright spots. I fired another round, buying myself a few more seconds. "Jake, you need to complete the circuit. The pattern has to be whole, or they'll all break through at once. I tried fixing it with the lead solder. They just chew through it faster than I can repair. Not solder. Pete's voice faded, then came back stronger. Blood. What? Iron in the blood. That's why the coffee worked. Iron filings, but blood is stronger, more personal. Mix it with the lead and it'll hold. I looked at the damaged symbols, then at the knife on my belt. How much blood? Enough to complete the circle. Maybe a pint, spread thin. Static overwhelmed his voice for a moment. Jake, there's something else. The thing they're trying to wake up. It's not just hungry. It's smart. It's been listening to everything that happens in the garage for decades. Learning. Planning. Planning what? Revenge. On the families that helped Eddie lock it away. The Henriksons. The O'Briens. Everyone who's been protected by the vehicles we service. Pete's voice was breaking up badly now. If it gets free, it won't just hunt randomly. It'll go after them specifically, and it knows where they all live. The second flare was dying. I lit the third and last one, knowing I had maybe 30 minutes of light left. After that, the mag light would have to do. I pulled out my knife and tested the edge against my thumb. Sharp enough. The cut sent a line of red down my palm, and I let it drip onto the damaged symbols. Where the blood hit, the symbols glowed white-hot. The shadows recoiled as if burned, pulling back from the repaired sections. But there were too many damaged areas, and I was already feeling lightheaded from the blood loss. Pete, I don't think I can fix all of them in time. You don't have to fix them all. Just complete the main binding, the outer circle. That's the primary lock. I traced the outer pattern with my eyes, marking the damaged sections. 7 major breaks, each one requiring enough blood to make the iron mixture effective. At this rate, I'd pass out before finishing half of them. There has to be another way. The torch. Pete's voice was barely audible now. Iron phosphorus burns hot enough to fuse the blood into the stone, create a permanent seal. I grabbed the modified propane torch and connected it to the special fuel tank. When I struck the igniter, blue flame shot out with surgical precision. The heat was incredible. I could feel it from 3 feet away. Working quickly, I moved from break to break in the outer circle. Cut, bleed, seal with the torch. Each repair sent waves of agony up my arm, but the symbols held. The white glow spread along the repaired sections, pushing the shadows further back. 5 breaks sealed. 6. The last flare guttered out. Darkness crashed over Bay 3 like a physical weight. I fumbled for the mag light with bloody hands, nearly dropping it as something brushed against my shoulder. When the flashlight beam cut through the black, I saw them clearly for the first time. They weren't shadows at all. They were holes. Spaces where reality had been torn away, revealing something underneath that human minds weren't designed to perceive. Looking at them directly felt like staring into a strobe light. Painful, disorienting, wrong. But I could see the last damaged section now, maybe 10 feet away. One more repair would complete the outer circle. I raised the knife, but something wrapped around my wrist. Not tentacles or claws, just absence, cold nothingness that made my fingers go numb. The knife clattered to the concrete. The torch was still in my other hand. I triggered the igniter, and blue flame roared to life, cutting through the thing that held me. It released my wrist with a sound like tearing paper. I dove for the knife, scooped it up, and slashed across my forearm. Blood poured onto the final break in the circle, and I followed immediately with the torch. White light exploded outward from the completed pattern. The holes in reality collapsed with sounds like breaking glass. and something underneath the foundation screamed, not in pain, but in rage at being denied. The binding circle flared once, twice, then settled into a steady glow that pushed the darkness back to the corners of the bay. I checked my watch through a haze of blood loss and exhaustion. 7:18 a.m. 5 minutes until sunrise. Pete's voice crackled through the phone, distant but clear. "You did it, son. You actually did it." Outside, I could hear the things retreating, flowing back to whatever spaces they'd emerged from. The danger was passing, but I could feel something watching me through the sealed circle. Something that would remember my face. Something that would be waiting if I ever broke the rules again. Sunrise came at exactly 7:23 a.m., just like Pete's journal had predicted. I watched it through the grimy windows of Bay 3, golden light creeping across the cornfields and touching the edges of the Henriksen farm. When the first rays hit the garage's exterior walls, I felt something shift in the air, a loosening, like pressure being released from a sealed container. The binding circle's glow faded to barely visible lines in the concrete. Whatever had been testing the barriers all night was gone, retreating to depths where sunlight couldn't follow. My left arm was wrapped in sharp rags, crude bandages that had mostly stopped the bleeding. The cuts would need proper medical attention, but they could wait until I figured out what to tell the emergency room. Farm accidents were common enough in Madison County. Nobody would ask too many questions. Pete arrived at 7:45, driving his ancient Chevy pickup with the careful precision of someone who'd gotten very little sleep. He looked older than I remembered from our brief meeting 3 months ago. More gray in his hair, deeper lines around his eyes, like he'd aged years in the span of a single night. "Jake." He stepped into Bay 3 and surveyed the scene. The repaired cymbals, the empty flare cases, the shotgun lying across the workbench. Hell of a first emergency call. Is that what this was? A test? Not planned, if that's what you're asking. Pete knelt beside the outer circle, running weathered fingers along the fresh repairs. The coffee machine failing like that was just bad luck. Murphy's Law in action. But the way you handled it. He stood slowly, favoring his right knee. Eddie would have been proud. The journal said Eddie Kowalski was the previous owner. Any relation. Pete's expression went carefully neutral. My uncle, he built this place in 1948, started the garage as a legitimate business, but the property had history. Old iron mine from the 1890s, played out and flooded when the vein ran dry. Eddie thought he was just pumping out groundwater when he excavated the foundation. What did he actually find? Passage to somewhere else. Somewhere that should have stayed sealed. Pete walked to the overhead door and activated the opener. Daylight flooded the bay, washing out the last traces of the symbol pattern. 11 miners died when the original shaft collapsed in 1894. Town figured it was a cave-in, unstable geology. But Eddie found their bones down there, and they weren't scattered like you'd expect from falling rock. I thought about the sounds I'd heard beneath the foundation. Purposeful scratching, coordinated attacks on the binding circle. Something killed them. Something hungry. Something that had been waiting in the dark for decades, hoping someone would dig deep enough to let it out. Pete opened a toolbox and pulled out a new coffee maker, still in its original packaging. Eddie spent 4 years figuring out how to lock it away again. Trial and error mostly. Lost 2 more men in the process. And you've been maintaining his work ever since. 35 years this October. Learned the trade from Eddie before he passed, along with the other responsibilities. Pete plugged in the new coffee maker, and began setting it up. Town doesn't know, of course. Can't let them know. People sleep better thinking the worst thing they might encounter is a drunk driver on Highway 92. I watched him measure coffee grounds with practiced precision. Why didn't you warn me? About what could happen if the rules were broken? Would you have believed me? Pete started the first pot brewing. Most folks think I'm just a paranoid old man with too many superstitions. Better to let you learn gradually, build up your understanding over time. Usually takes months before someone's ready for the full truth. I nearly died tonight, but you didn't. And more importantly, you held the line. Pete's eyes were serious now, measuring me like he was calculating load-bearing capacity. Not everyone would have stayed. Most people would have run when the lights went out. I thought about those moments in the darkness, surrounded by things that shouldn't exist. The temptation to bolt for the door had been overwhelming. I thought about it, but you didn't. That tells me something important about your character. Pete poured 2 cups of coffee from the fresh pot. The smell was different from the previous batches, sharper with a metallic undertone that made my teeth ache. Iron filings, among other things. Recipe took Eddie years to perfect. Pete handed me a cup. Drink up. You lost a lot of blood tonight. The coffee was bitter, but it helped clear the fog from my head. Whatever was in it worked faster than caffeine alone. Within minutes, my vision sharpened and the shakiness in my hands subsided. So what happens now? I asked. Do I keep working nights? Pretend this was all some kind of weird dream? That depends. Pete sat down heavily on a rolling stool. The binding circle is stronger now than it's been in years. Your blood sealed it properly, created connections that will last decades, but that also means you're connected to it permanently. Connected how? You're part of the system now. The thing down there knows your scent, your energy signature. If you leave Winterset, if you stop maintaining the protections. Pete shrugged. It'll find ways to reach you. Distance won't matter much. The implications hit me like a physical blow. I'm trapped here. Not trapped, bound. There's a difference. Pete's voice was gentle but firm. Eddie chose this responsibility. I chose it when he passed. Now you've chosen it too, whether you realized it or not. I thought about my apartment above Doherty's feed store, my few possessions, the life I'd been building in this small Iowa town. It wasn't much, but it was mine, or had been. What about Dorothy Henriksen? The other families you protect? Do they know what's really happening? Some of them suspect. The older families, the ones who've been here since Eddie's time. They remember stories. Weird accidents on back roads, vehicles that broke down in specific locations, people who disappeared near the old mine site. Pete finished his coffee and stood. But they don't ask direct questions. Safer that way. Through the bay windows, I could see normal life resuming in Winterset. Traffic picking up on Highway 92, farmers heading out to check their livestock, the gradual awakening of a community that had no idea how close it had come to catastrophe. There's something else, Pete continued. The modifications we make to vehicles, the symbols, the protective coatings, they're temporary. Every few months, people need to bring their trucks and cars back for routine maintenance. Gives us a chance to refresh the protections. How many vehicles are we talking about? About 60% of the county's registered vehicles, maybe 300 cars and trucks total. Pete pulled out a scheduling book, pages marked with symbols I was beginning to recognize. Dorothy's transmission was due for renewal last week. She was cutting it close. I thought about the symbols that had appeared and disappeared on her transmission housing. They really work. Better than you might expect. Iron content in the protective coatings creates a field that most supernatural entities avoid. Not perfect, but enough to keep families safe during routine travel. Pete flipped through appointment pages. Of course, now that you're part of the system, you'll be able to see the symbols all the time. They don't disappear for blood-bonded guardians. Guardians? That's what Eddie called us. Guardians of the threshold. Keepers of the lock. Pete's smile was tired but genuine. Welcome to the family business, Jake. It's not the career path I'd recommend, but the benefits package is unique. I looked around Bay 3, taking in the subtle modifications that made it different from a normal service area. The symbols carved into every surface, the specialized tools, the emergency cabinet with its cache of supernatural countermeasures. This was my life now, my responsibility. One more question, I said. The rules, all 8 of them. Are there more I should know about? Pete nodded toward the office. Pete's original list was the basics, enough to keep you alive during normal operations. But there are seasonal variations, lunar cycle adjustments, special protocols for certain types of supernatural activity. He paused. And emergency procedures for when the binding fails completely. Fails? I thought we fixed it. We reinforced it. But nothing lasts forever, Jake. Eddie's original work is almost 70 years old. Your blood bought us time, maybe decades, but eventually we'll need a permanent solution. What kind of permanent solution? Pete's expression went very serious. That's a conversation for another day. Right now, you need medical attention for those cuts, and I need to update the protection schedules for next month. He handed me a set of keys. These are yours now. Front door, office, emergency cabinet. Everything you need to keep the town safe. I accepted the keys, feeling their weight. More than metal, they carried the accumulated responsibility of 3 generations of guardians. Outside, Winterset was waking up to another normal day, blissfully unaware of the supernatural war being fought beneath their feet. And I was part of that war now, whether I'd asked for it or not. 2 weeks later, someone finally asked about the Kowalski special. I'd gotten comfortable with the routine by then. The cuts on my arm had healed into pale scars that itched when storms approached. Pete had taught me the proper way to mix the protective coatings, shown me which symbols worked best for different vehicle types, and explained the scheduling system that kept 300 families safe from things they'd never see coming. The garage felt different now. I could perceive layers of protection built into every surface, not just the obvious symbols in Bay 3, but subtle markings around door frames, iron filings mixed into the concrete foundation, even protective sigils painted under the coffee maker. What had seemed like a normal auto shop was actually a fortress, designed to contain something that should never see daylight. Business was good. Word had spread that Pete's new night mechanic knew his way around an engine, and the appointment book stayed full. I'd serviced Dorothy's transmission twice more, refreshing the protective coatings each time. She never mentioned the symbols, but she always paid in cash and left generous tips. The customer who changed everything walked in at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday, 13 minutes before my shift officially started. I was finishing up an oil change on Father Martinez's Buick when I heard footsteps in the office. "We're closed," I called out, not looking up from the drain pan. "Open again at 6. I'm not here for regular service." The voice was wrong somehow, too smooth, like someone practicing a foreign accent. "I heard you might have something special, something called the Kowalski special." My hands froze on the drain plug. Rule 7. If someone asks about the Kowalski special, tell them we're out of parts. I wiped my hands and walked to the office. The customer stood with his back to me, studying Pete's collection of coffee mugs on the shelf behind the register. Tall man in a brown coat, unremarkable except for the way he held himself. Too still, like a statue pretending to breathe. "Sorry, we're out of parts for that particular service," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Maybe try again next month." He turned around. His face was perfectly normal. Pleasant features, mild expression, the kind of face you'd forget 5 minutes after meeting. But his eyes were wrong. Not the color or shape, just the way they focused. Like he was looking through me at something more interesting behind my shoulder. Out of parts. He smiled, and his teeth were too white. That's what Pete always said too, but I think you might be more accommodating. Pete's the owner. I just work nights. Oh, I know exactly who you are, Jake Olson, the new guardian, the one who sealed the circle with his own blood. He stepped closer, and I caught his scent. Ozone and copper, like the air before a lightning strike. I've been watching you learn the trade. Very impressive work. I backed toward the tool cabinet where Pete kept the emergency shotgun. I think you should leave. I think I should stay. We have business to discuss. The man, or thing wearing a man's shape, moved to block my path to the weapons. You see, the Kowalski special isn't a type of automotive service. It's a person, Edward Kowalski to be specific. Eddie's been dead for 15 years. Dead, yes, but not gone. Not entirely. The thing smiled wider, showing more teeth than any human mouth should hold. He's down there with my master, in the spaces beneath your precious garage. Has been since 1987, when he made the ultimate sacrifice to strengthen the binding. The coffee pot began to hiss behind me, iron filings reacting to supernatural presence. I could feel the protective symbols in the walls warming up, responding to the threat. You're lying. Am I? Check Pete's journal more carefully. Look for the entries from October 1987, specifically October 31st. Halloween night, when the binding circle cracked and something almost broke through. The thing tilted its head at an angle that would have snapped human vertebrae. Eddie threw himself into the breach, became part of the lock itself. Very heroic, very permanent. I thought about Pete's careful records. The way he talked about Eddie in past tense but never mentioned a funeral or burial. The gaps in the journal entries around that date. What do you want? A trade. The Kowalski special for something you value more. The thing reached into its coat and pulled out a cell phone. The screen showed a photo of my apartment building in Sioux City. Your father's construction business failed because certain permits were mysteriously revoked. Certain inspectors found problems that didn't exist. Certain creditors demanded payment ahead of schedule. My stomach dropped. You did that. My master has many servants. Some wear human faces and work in government offices. Others prefer more direct approaches. The phone screen changed, showing my father loading boxes into a rental truck. He's living in his brother's basement now, 62 years old, broken by financial ruin he never understood. All because you happened to answer a help-wanted ad. Leave my family alone. That's entirely up to you. Bring Eddie Kowalski to the surface, and your father's troubles disappear. Refuse, and they get much worse. The thing pocketed the phone. You have until Halloween night. 3 days. I don't know how to... You'll figure it out. You're a guardian now. Eddie's blood runs in your veins since you sealed the circle. That creates connections. The thing moved toward the front door with fluid grace. Oh, and Jake. Don't bother calling Pete. He's currently indisposed. It stepped outside and vanished between one footstep and the next, leaving only the smell of ozone and the sound of coffee boiling over on its burner. I grabbed Pete's cell phone from my jacket and dialed his number. Straight to voicemail. His landline rang busy. The emergency number produced only dead air. I was on my own. The journal was still in Pete's filing cabinet, and I read through October 1987 with growing dread. The entries became increasingly frantic as Halloween approached. Reports of supernatural activity throughout the county. Vehicles breaking down on specific roads. Children disappearing near the old mine site, only to return days later with no memory of where they'd been. And then, on October 30th. The binding is failing. 40 years of pressure from below has created stress fractures in Eddie's original work. Tomorrow night, when the veil is thinnest, something will break through unless drastic action is taken. October 31st was blank, except for a single line. Eddie's made his choice. God help us all. November 1st. The binding holds. Eddie is gone. I'm the only guardian now. I closed the journal and looked around the office. Somewhere beneath my feet, Eddie Kowalski was trapped in whatever realm existed below the foundation. Alive enough to be bargained for. Dead enough to anchor the supernatural lock that protected an entire county. And something wanted him back badly enough to threaten my family. I thought about my father, loading his life into boxes because his business had been systematically destroyed. About the thing that wore a human face but moved like liquid shadow. About the deadline I'd been given and the choice I'd have to make. 3 days until Halloween. 3 days to figure out how to save my father without dooming everyone in Madison County. I started the night's first pot of coffee and began planning. The journal contained hints about emergency protocols, references to extraction procedures, and threshold manipulation. Eddie had left clues for future guardians, coded instructions for scenarios he'd hoped would never arise. But as I read deeper into his notes, one thing became clear. Freeing Eddie from the binding would require another guardian to take his place. Someone would have to go down into the darkness and stay there. Someone like me. The coffee finished brewing, iron-rich steam carrying the scent of protection and sacrifice. Outside, Winterset slept peacefully, unaware that their safety hung in the balance of an impossible choice. I had 3 days to find another option. 3 days to prove that some problems had solutions that didn't require heroic martyrdom. 3 days to save my father without becoming a permanent resident of the spaces between worlds. The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight, marking the beginning of what might be my final shift as a guardian of the threshold. Unless I could find a way to cheat the system Eddie had died to create, Halloween night arrived with the smell of snow in the air and Pete Kowalski chained to a chair in the parts storage room. I found him when I came in for my shift at midnight, duct tape over his mouth and fury in his eyes. The thing that wanted Eddie back had kept its word about Pete being indisposed, but it hadn't killed him. That would have been too simple. I freed Pete quickly, checking him for injuries. Bruised wrists, dehydration, but nothing serious. He'd been fed and watered like livestock, kept alive to witness whatever the creature had planned for tonight. "Jake," he rasped when I pulled the tape away. "Don't do it. Don't give them Eddie." I wasn't planning to. I helped him to the office chair and poured coffee. "But I needed you conscious for the real plan." Pete's eyes narrowed. "What real plan?" I spread Eddie's journal open to a page I'd found buried in the appendices. Formulas written in faded pencil, calculations that hurt to look at directly. Eddie wasn't the first guardian to go down there, just the most recent. The original miners weren't killed by accident. They volunteered. The mine collapse in 1894 was staged to hide what really happened. I pointed to a passage Eddie had written in the margins. 11 men went down there willingly, knowing they'd never come back up. They became the first binding, the foundation lock. Pete studied the equations with growing understanding, and Eddie joined them when the original binding weakened. Right. But here's what the thing outside doesn't know. I flipped to a diagram that showed the mine's layout, tunnels that connected to natural cave systems throughout Madison County. The binding isn't just under this garage, it's everywhere. The whole county sits on top of a massive containment grid. What are you saying? I'm saying we don't trade Eddie for my father's safety. We offer something better. I checked my watch. 12:47 a.m. We expand the grid, create redundancy, make the whole system stronger instead of just maintaining what's already there. Through the front windows, I could see shapes moving in the darkness. The creature had brought friends for Halloween night, shadows that flowed between the trees like oil between machinery. They were gathering for the exchange, confident they'd won. Pete was shaking his head. Jake, the energy required to expand the binding grid. It would take dozens of guardians. We don't have those kinds of numbers. We don't need dozens. I pulled out the modified propane torch from the emergency cabinet. We just need to be creative about power sources. The thing in the brown coat materialized in the office doorway at exactly 1 a.m., still wearing its perfectly forgettable human face. Behind it, I could see more shapes pressing against the windows, hungry things that had been waiting decades for this moment. Time's up, Guardian. Where's my Kowalski special? Right here, I said, and triggered the torch. But instead of aiming at the creature, I pointed the flame at my own hand. Blue fire met the scars on my palm, and every protection symbol in the garage flared to life simultaneously. What are you doing? The thing snarled, its human mask beginning to slip. Rewriting the contract. I pressed my burning hand to the floor, letting blood and flame combine with the iron filings Pete had mixed into the concrete. Eddie's bound to the grid by sacrifice and pain. I'm bound by blood and choice. Different kinds of connection, but equal strength. The symbols began to change, spreading outward from my palm like digital code, not just reinforcing the existing pattern, but expanding it, creating new pathways, building bridges. You can have Eddie, I continued as power flowed through the grid. But you'll have to take all of us, every guardian who's ever contributed to the binding, every drop of blood that sealed these symbols, every choice made to protect this place. The creature was backing away as the light intensified. Around the building, its shadowy allies were retreating into the cornfields. That's not the deal we made. It's the deal I'm making. I stood up, my hand still smoking from the torch. Take it or leave it. The thing fled. Pete was staring at me with something between admiration and concern. Jake, what did you just do? Change the rules? I flexed my burned hand, watching new scars form over the old ones. The binding is distributed now, shared between every guardian who's ever served. No single point of failure. And Eddie? Still down there, but not alone anymore, not carrying the whole load by himself. I walked to the window and looked out at the peaceful Iowa countryside. My father got a call this morning. All his permits were mysteriously approved. The bank decided to restructure his loans at favorable terms. Pete smiled. You negotiated. I learned from the best. I started a fresh pot of coffee, watching the iron filings swirl in the water. Besides, some things are worth protecting, even if it means spending the rest of your life in a garage in Winterset, Iowa. Outside, dawn was still hours away. But for the first time since I'd taken this job, I wasn't counting the minutes until sunrise. I was home,